does it mean to be dust and ashes? Ash Wednesday is this Wednesday, so that's part of why I'm thinking about it. Imagine, if you will, that you are living, and it's also based on our discussion of the last discussion today of the book Ishmael by Daniel Quinn. So I want you to imagine that you are living on this continent in the late 1800s, and you are an indigenous person, and you are experiencing trauma because of the invasion of a new and different people. Much of your experience has been tragically been through encountering soldiers after the Civil War and missionaries, Christian missionaries and settlers who are now becoming ever present. The population seems to be growing all the time. They're coming on wagon trains and on horseback and by foot. And they're telling you that you must now live in a certain place, and you must now live in a certain way, or you will die. And you have experienced violence as your life has been changed by battles and by massacres. And there is a deeper question that you might be asking yourself. Why? Why is this happening? And underneath that, as like peeling an onion, underneath that layer is a question, well, what justifies them doing this to us? What do they believe? What is their story? So there may have been some people asking those questions that history now allows us to investigate as we look back in time. What gave those in power the justification to do what they did? And then a probing question for us is, do we now consciously or unconsciously believe in what they did? And we might, of course, say, well, no, we don't believe in what they did, but we have carried on that legacy no matter if we believed it or not. How do we deal with that kind of past? How do we address the future in light of what we believe? And how do we uncover those beliefs and those conscious and unconscious beliefs that we live? So now imagine sitting around a fire at night in your lodge or your hogan or your teepee or your longhouse, and hearing your leaders, you indigenous people, hearing your leaders then offer an explanation of who these invaders are. And they tell you, this is where Creator put us, this home where we were birthed from the ground and our ancestors are buried. Our Creator put us here. This is what we believe. This is true for us. This other people, they believe their God told them this is now their land and has given it to them. It's their explaining story. We have one, they have one. They say it's true, but it's not true for us. So now I want you to go back further than 150 years, if you can. Imagine being alive, say, 2,600 years ago, in the 6th and 5th centuries before the Common Era, about the time the stories from Genesis, the first 4 chapters, were told around night fires. And those stories of creation and fall, like it or not, have become our explaining stories. And you don't have to believe them. You don't have to take them literally. They were not meant, I believe, to be presented as facts of what happened and when it happened, so we can then understand them mythologically. They were meant to convey truths, understandings of what is and what will ever be. And whether it took 7 days or millions of years, the story says God created the world and all things within. And it could be a positive story. It could be a blessing. So an interpretation of the story in Genesis 1 through 4 says that we humans then succumbed to temptation and ate the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And thus, Adam and Eve made a decision that determined our future. Not questioning the fairness of it, it's just accepted as kind of fact, all right? Even if the Adam and Eve of this story didn't literally exist, we draw this conclusion that because we disobeyed God, we have fallen into sin and now experience suffering and death as a punishment. And this explaining story we have come to believe about ourselves is negative. It's not a blessing. So the second slide from Genesis 3 gives you a little bit more of this. Because you have done this, cursed are you among all animals and among all wild creatures. Upon your belly you shall go, and dust you shall eat all the days of your life. By the sweat of your face you shall eat bread until you return to the ground, for out of it you were taken. You are dust, and to dust you shall return. I kind of feel like I should be like that tree in The Wizard of Oz when they come along and pick the apples, and he starts throwing them at people, throwing them at Dorothy and the fearless lion and the scarecrow and the Tin Man. Because our ancestors sinned and ate of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil as punishment, then we were cut off from the tree of life in the garden and banished from that Garden of Eden. God is then on guard, Scripture says, to make sure we will not succeed if and when we storm the gates to get back in. And then what happens? Well, Eve and Adam have sex, which is now understood as a shameful act, and Eve gives birth to Cain, who is a farmer, and then Abel, who is a shepherd, and each of them bring their offerings to God. And God accepts the shepherd Abel's offering, which wasn't probably an apple, okay? God does not accept Cain's offering. No explanation is given in Genesis. It just says God rejected and accepted, which makes Cain angry. And then he kills Abel. And the descendants of Cain are then further banished from the garden east of Eden to the land of Nod. Musician Daniel O'Keefe said it better than anybody I've ever read before when he sang, Cain said to Adam, how can it be fair? You double my burden and you lessen my share. Your love is uneven, and so is the score, and you force me to wander from door to door. So in other words, simple terms, we are banished from the garden, and we are cursed to return to the dust of the ground. There you are, 2,600 years ago, cursed. Now I want you to jump ahead again, but stay back 150 years and try to understand how someone can come to believe what they do about themselves that justifies the driving forces of manifest destiny, which are theft and slavery and massacre. And I paraphrase Charles Darwin. Human history is determined by what we believe about ourselves. That's why I like the Kuf Creed so much, the covenant in this community, because it's what we believe about ourselves. And we need to keep saying it over and over again until we really do, right? Okay? Darwin also said that one of the ways to make a sizable impact on a human history is to create a creed. The Latin word being credo, which means I believe. So as we say those words together, we're saying this is what we believe about ourselves, not something else. This is intentionally what we believe. It's wonderful stuff. An insight from Daniel Quinn in the book Ishmael is that a culture is a group of people enacting a story, what they believe about themselves, as to make it true. And from Lakota holy man Black Elk, if this story is true for you, then it's true. He's not debating whether it's true for everyone, but it's true for you if it's true. For you, it's true. So we create a life to which we pledge our allegiance. Perhaps you can understand this in a personal way. Have you ever had an experience in which you discovered that what you have long believed about yourself is not true? Maybe that you were Canadian at one time in the past, and you discover you're not, and you say, oh, shit, I can't. Oh, anyway. Yeah. I have a great uncle who was Canadian. Does that make me close enough? I don't know. Have you ever had that happen to you? That something, because I had that happen with my name. One of my ancestors' middle names, because it was a mother's maiden name, was Putnam, and I always would learn that I was related to the great Putnam family lineage, and then a relative one day told me on the phone, well, I'm sorry to disappoint you, but it wasn't Putnam, it was Putman. You're a commoner. Oh, well. It destroyed an image I had about myself. Or perhaps you decided you didn't need to continue to live in a way that reinforced a negative belief that you had about yourself. And if a story applies to all humanity, as many think Genesis 3-4 does, what if we got that story wrong? What if it's just not the way that we have interpreted it to be? Is there another way to understand it? Is there another way to understand yourself and what you believe about yourself? Well, Daniel Quinn's book Ishmael is a novel set in a Socratic dialogue between a generic man and a gorilla. The gorilla's name is Ishmael. It was also the name of the Hebrew Scriptures person in the book of Genesis that was banished. Firstborn son of Abraham to his slave girl Hagar, banished from the tribe. Ishmael represents then all those and all nature who have suffered at the hands of those who believe that God gave certain people the manifest destiny to rule. And through Ishmael, the son of Hagar and Abraham, and Ishmael the gorilla in this book, represent all those banished by those in power. Daniel Quinn exposes the belief in the story within which we live by questioning the truth of what we have taken to be our explaining story as a culture and as a society. And Ishmael then also points out that it's like water to a fish, or the air that we breathe. We don't even know it's there. And it doesn't matter if we literally believe it or not, because we live it to make it true. And we can't change it until we become woke, right? Become woke to the story. And then we find a different story within which to live, or we will keep living the same story over and over again, century after century. So this particular story, this particular creed or credo explaining story says that you read just a second ago from Genesis. It says we suffer and we die and we return to the dust of the earth as a punishment for our sins. Okay, well, the idea that Daniel Quinn presents is that the story that we believe ourselves is similar to what may have been told by indigenous people. Remember, you're sitting back there in your teepee or your hogan or your lodge, and you were listening to your elders tell you this story about a people who were living a different story, about these invaders who were committing genocide. And they might have been thinking, how bizarre. They think, these invaders, that they have eaten of the tree, God's tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And they can decide who lives or dies. They think they have eaten of that tree. And Ishmael is suggesting that the story of original sin and being cursed in the ground is a story indigenous people were telling about somebody else as a way of understanding why this strange people could do these horrible things to them. It's a reversal. It's a mind shift. Those people think they have the wisdom and the power of the gods. Why else would they act this way? Don't they know the tree of life is there for all of us together in creation? They haven't eaten of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil because no one can. That tree is reserved for the gods. And now, centuries later, we have lived a story believing that we are just as wise and powerful as the gods. And yet, paradoxically, our punishment is that we will die. Does that sound like there's something wrong with that story? Well, here's an idea. This is where Quinn comes in. We got the story wrong. We also, and we live so as to make it true, and we don't know how to live a different one. And as we have lived it, we have done a pretty thorough job of getting rid of anyone who lives a different story. So, a couple of statements from authors that you might be aware of. A thought from Wendell Berry. We cannot live except within limits, and these limits are of many kinds: spatial, material, moral, spiritual. The world has room for many people who are content to live as humans, but only for a relative few intent upon living as giants or as gods. And then a thought from Matthew Fox. When we lost the sense of mythology and the cosmos, we became neurotic and had to invent psychoanalysis to heal ourselves. I love that comment. I heard that as I sat in a classroom with a bunch of Lutheran seminary students. And it's like, what did he just say about us? Well, if all this is confusing, I get it. It's contrary to what many of us have consciously or subconsciously come to believe. It's like being right-handed and trying to change that. Anybody ever tried to do that? Or had to because you broke a finger or your wrist and had to try to write with your other hand, or left or right, doesn't matter. It's like trying to learn to read or do math through traditional methods when your brain works in a different way. I had this unfortunately painful experience trying to learn to do a certain level of math because it just didn't work the way I was being taught. Didn't work. Or trying to learn to read music. It does not work because the way I was being addressed didn't coordinate with how my brain is working. If your brain works this way, it's pretty tough to get it to work in a different way. It's like believing you are a biological child of your parents and then learning you are adopted. So I will sum it up as simply as I can. Understood in our traditional way, the story says that God told us not to eat that tree, but we did it of that tree, but we did it anyway, and now we're destined to die as a punishment. But what Ishmael says is you can eat all the apples or the dates or the figs that you want. Go ahead. They won't give you the knowledge of good and evil. That's the knowledge that's reserved. It's above your pay grade. If there are gods, it's above your pay grade. If there are no gods, then it's the natural law of life. What you have, though, is the tree of life. Live within the laws of nature, and life is yours. And within that garden of life, you are born from the dust of the earth, and to that dust and earth you will return. Doesn't say it's a punishment. That's what these people were telling a story about, those guys, those invaders that did. They think they've eaten in that, and they're going to die. We're going to continue to live if they just leave us alone. Well, you might wonder, well, why is it that way? Why did God create the world that way? Why do we die? Well, who knows? We're not gods. If there is such a thing, that's their call, not ours. Life is a gift, and life includes death. And even though we don't quite get it, we don't need to be saved from the earth and from dust. And as created, we simply are subject to the laws of the universe. In fact, if we live within the law of the universe, the laws of the universe, the tree of life will continue to be ours. And that sounds like a blessing to me. But when we stray from it, if we turn a blessing into a curse, if we turn it into a curse, then life as we know it will end. That's our choice. So I say all this because I'm reminded once again, I'm a cyclical person after 30-some years of doing this stuff. The season of Lent begins this week on Ash Wednesday. It's when Christians acknowledge that we are born from the dust, and to the dust we will return. If one looks deep enough and hard enough, going beyond a narrow and quite possibly bad or misinterpretation of an explaining story, one might come to realize that there is plenty of room for us to change our minds and live within the limits of what it means to be a human in this garden that we call home. By living a different story, we can humbly recognize our place on this earth as humans, not created to be perfect. In other words, I can miss the mark, but to be human within creation. And it has become my practice then over the years on Ash Wednesday, when I put ashes on people's foreheads, to say these words of blessing, which to some is a new story in which to live, and which Reverend Bruce shared with us a few Sundays ago. It comes from a Hasidic tradition, Jewish Hasidic tradition, with the rabbi who had two pieces of paper, one in each pocket, and on one were the words, "You are dust and ashes," and the other said, "For your sake, the world was created." May we then be a blessing to all creation as we live and as we die. Thank you.